Mayday! Mayday! Communications failure! We're going dark! The radio crackled once, then died completely. Rebecca Thompson's hands flew across her workbench as alarms blared throughout Naval Station Norfolk's Emergency Communications Center. 2 SEAL teams were trapped 180 miles offshore. No radio, no GPS. No way home through the storm. Rebecca ripped open the backup satellite transceiver that had just arrived from the field. Salt corroded, circuit boards fried, completely dead. The rescue window was closing. In 4 hours, the hurricane would make any extraction impossible. "Thompson!" Commander Hayes burst through the door. "Tell me you can fix this!" Rebecca's auburn hair whipped as she spun around, soldering iron already heating. Her calloused 25-year-old hands moved with surgical precision, pulling components apart. Most officers saw a quiet contractor in stained coveralls. They had no idea what she was capable of. Her grandfather's compass pendant caught the harsh fluorescent light. Vietnam Navy, 1969. He'd saved his crew when their radio died in enemy waters. Tonight, 2 SEAL teams needed a miracle. Before we continue, if you believe skilled technicians deserve respect in life-or-death situations, type respect below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story hits different when I know who's standing with Rebecca. I read every comment. Rebecca had worked at Norfolk for 3 years, invisible among the base's 40,000 personnel. She arrived at 600 every morning, walking through security gates that barely registered her presence. In her small workshop tucked behind the main communications building, she repaired equipment that kept America's most elite warriors connected to home. Her father had been an electronics engineer at NASA. Before he died when Rebecca was 16, he taught her that circuits were like languages. Once you understood their logic, they would tell you their secrets. "Every wire has a story, Becca," he'd whispered during his final hospital stay. "Listen carefully and they'll never lie to you." Now, staring at the destroyed transceiver, Rebecca listened. The salt corrosion told her the unit had been submerged. Burn marks on the main processor suggested electrical surge. Someone had tried field repairs using the wrong voltage. She could see where amateur soldering had made everything worse. "How long?" Commander Hayes demanded. His weathered face showed the strain of 2 decades in special operations. Behind him stood Master Chief Rodriguez, whose concerned expression revealed what Hayes wouldn't say. They'd lost contact with their teams 4 hours ago. "I need parts," Rebecca said quietly, already visualizing the repair sequence. "The frequency modulator is fried. The encryption board is dead. The power regulation system has cascade failures throughout." "English, Thompson." "It's destroyed, sir." "But," Rebecca pulled out her personal toolkit, revealing components she'd collected over years of complex repairs. "I can rebuild it. Give me 2 hours." Hayes checked his watch. The storm was intensifying. Weather reports showed hurricane-force winds building offshore. The rescue window wouldn't wait for anyone. 1 hour, he said. "That's all we have." As the door slammed shut, Rebecca was already deep in the zone that had defined her since childhood. Her hands moved independently of conscious thought, decades of experience guiding every movement. She pulled replacement circuits from her spare parts collection, each component carefully tested and cataloged for moments exactly like this. The first circuit board came together in 20 minutes. Rebecca's soldering was surgical, each connection perfect, each pathway precisely calculated. She could feel her father's presence guiding her hands, his voice reminding her that someone's life always depended on getting it right. Outside, she could hear vehicles rushing back and forth, the entire base mobilizing for search and rescue operations. But in her workshop, there was only Rebecca, the broken transceiver, and the clock counting down to disaster. 30 minutes remaining. 2 SEAL teams lost at sea. 1 chance to bring them home. Rebecca's soldering iron moved like a surgeon's scalpel across the circuit board. Every connection had to be perfect. 1 faulty joint could mean 14 Navy SEALs would never see home again. "Status report!" Commander Hayes burst back in, coffee-stained and clearly operating on no sleep. Primary communications array restored, Rebecca replied without looking up. Her concentration was absolute. Working on the encryption module now. What Hayes couldn't see was the impossible complexity of what Rebecca was accomplishing. The military-grade encryption system she was rebuilding by hand would normally require specialized factory equipment. She was doing it with basic tools and salvaged components, improvising solutions that shouldn't work but somehow did. Master Chief Rodriguez watched from the doorway. 25 years in the Navy had taught him to recognize exceptional skill when he saw it. "Commander," he said quietly, "she's not just fixing it, she's redesigning it." Rebecca's fingers traced circuit pathways that existed only in her mind. The original design had been flawed, vulnerable to saltwater intrusion, exactly like what had happened to the teams offshore. As she rebuilt, she was strengthening weak points, adding redundancies, creating something better than what the manufacturer had originally made. Her grandfather's compass pendant swayed as she leaned over the workbench. Thomas Thompson, electronics technician first class, had served on destroyers during Vietnam. The stories he'd told Rebecca as a child weren't about combat. They were about the quiet heroes who kept the lights on, the radios working, the navigation systems running. "War is won by the people nobody sees," he'd always said. The encryption module clicked into place. Rebecca powered up the system and held her breath. Green lights cascaded across the display, each one representing a successful connection, a system coming online, hope returning. "We have partial communications," she announced. "I can establish contact, but the signal won't be strong enough for full operational range. The primary amplifier is still damaged." Hayes grabbed the microphone. "Trident Base, this is Norfolk Control. Do you copy?" Static filled the room for endless seconds. Then, faint but clear, "Norfolk Control, Trident Base. Thank God. We have 14 souls in the water. GPS is down. We need immediate guidance for extraction point." Rebecca could hear the strain in the SEAL team leader's voice. They'd been fighting storm conditions for hours with no way to communicate their position. Now they had minutes before the weather made rescue impossible. "The amplifier," Hayes said urgently. "Can you fix it?" Rebecca was already pulling apart the power system. The amplifier required specific voltage tolerances. Too little and the signal wouldn't reach the teams, too much, and she'd fry every circuit she'd just repaired. She needed components she didn't have, with precision she couldn't achieve using basic equipment. "I can jury-rig something," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. "But it's going to be unstable. The signal might cut out at any moment." "Do it." Rebecca pulled every high-powered component from her spare parts collection. Radio amplifiers, power supplies, even the motor controller from a broken test device. She began connecting them in series, creating a Frankenstein amplifier that violated every engineering principle but might just work. Her hands moved faster now, driven by desperation and determination. Outside, she could hear helicopters spinning up, rescue teams preparing to launch the moment they had a target location. Everything depended on the next 5 minutes. The improvised amplifier came together like a piece of abstract art. Wires running in impossible directions, components stacked and interconnected in ways that would horrify any textbook engineer. But Rebecca had learned from her father that sometimes the most elegant solutions looked like chaos to everyone else. She connected the final power coupling and held her breath. The jury-rigged amplifier hummed to life, power levels climbing toward the red zone. "Testing signal strength," she announced, praying her calculations were correct. The signal strength meter climbed steadily, 40%, 60%, 80%. Rebecca watched the needle approach the red zone, knowing she was pushing every component beyond its design limits. One miscalculation would destroy everything. "Signal is strong," came the voice through the speaker. "Norfolk Control, we have clear communication. Requesting immediate extraction coordinates." Master Chief Rodriguez stepped closer to Rebecca's workbench, studying the impossible tangle of wires and components she'd assembled. In 25 years of naval service, he'd never seen anything like it. "Thompson," he said quietly, Where did you learn to do this? Rebecca's hands continued working as she spoke, fine-tuning connections to stabilize the signal. My grandfather served on the USS Joseph P. Kennedy during Vietnam. He taught me that every piece of equipment tells you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. What she didn't tell them was the rest of the story. Thomas Thompson had been aboard the destroyer when their main communications array was destroyed during a night engagement in 1969. Cut off from the fleet with wounded aboard, he'd spent 18 hours rebuilding their radio system using parts cannibalized from throughout the ship. The compass pendant Rebecca wore had been his, carried through 4 combat deployments, present during every repair he'd made under fire. Before he died, he'd pressed it into her teenage hands with words that still echoed in her mind. This compass never pointed to magnetic north, Becca. It always pointed toward home, wherever our people needed to get back safely. Now, as she watched the signal strength hold steady at maximum power, Rebecca felt that compass pulling her forward. 2 SEAL teams needed to find their way home through a hurricane. Her grandfather's spirit was guiding her hands just as it had guided his decades ago. "Coordinates locked in," Hayes announced into the microphone. "Extraction helicopters launching in 2 minutes. Hold your position." But even as the rescue operation began, Rebecca could see warning signs in her jury-rigged amplifier. The power coupling she'd improvised was overheating. Voltage fluctuations were appearing throughout the system. Her miracle repair was living on borrowed time. "Commander," she said quietly, "the amplifier won't hold much longer, maybe 10 more minutes." Hayes checked his watch. The helicopters needed at least 15 minutes to reach the teams, plus time to coordinate the extraction. They were cutting it impossibly close. Rebecca made a decision that would have terrified any rational engineer. She began rerouting power from non-essential systems throughout her workshop, feeding everything into the failing amplifier. Emergency lighting went dark. Her computer shut down. Even the air conditioning died as she channeled every available volt into keeping the communication link alive. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez asked. "Buying them time," Rebecca replied, sweat beading on her forehead as she monitored rapidly changing readings across a dozen different meters. She was flying blind now, using instinct and experience to balance a system that shouldn't exist. The temperature in her workshop began rising without air conditioning. The improvised amplifier was generating tremendous heat, and Rebecca could smell insulation beginning to burn. She had maybe 5 more minutes before something caught fire or the system collapsed completely. Through the speaker, they could hear helicopter rotors and shouted commands as the extraction began. "First team aboard," came the report. "Moving to second position." Rebecca's hands never stopped moving, constantly adjusting connections and power levels to compensate for failing components. The compass pendant swung with each movement, catching reflections from the few remaining lights still powered in her workshop. Her grandfather had saved his crew by sacrificing everything else on the ship that wasn't essential for getting home. Now Rebecca was following his example, burning out her entire workshop to keep 2 SEAL teams connected to their lifeline. The question was whether her equipment would last long enough to bring them all home safe. As smoke began rising from the overloaded amplifier, Rebecca's mind flashed back to the story her grandfather had never fully told, until his final day in the hospital. Thomas Thompson had been 22 years old, barely older than Rebecca was now, when the USS Joseph P. Kennedy came under fire in the South China Sea. Enemy shore batteries had knocked out their primary communications during a night mission, leaving them blind and isolated 30 miles from the nearest friendly vessel. "I had no business attempting what I tried that night," he'd whispered to Rebecca as machines beeped around his hospital bed. "But 18 sailors were wounded, and we couldn't call for medical evacuation. Sometimes you have to do impossible things because people are counting on you." For 18 hours, Thomas had crawled through damaged sections of the destroyer, pulling wire and components from systems that weren't critical for immediate survival. The ship's radar went dark. Interior lighting failed. Even the galley equipment was stripped for parts as he built a communication system from scratch. "The compass I'm giving you," he'd said, pressing the worn silver pendant into Rebecca's hands. I wore it through every repair that night. Not because it pointed north, it was broken even then, but because it reminded me that every wire I connected was someone's way home. Now, as Rebecca watched her own improvised system begin to fail, she understood her grandfather's desperation. Through the radio, she could hear the rescue operation continuing. "Second team located, beginning extraction." But her jury-rigged amplifier was dying. Voltage readings were dropping despite every adjustment she made. The smell of burning electronics filled her workshop as components pushed beyond their limits began to fail one by one. "Signal strength dropping to 60%, she announced, her voice steady despite the disaster unfolding on her workbench. Commander Hayes grabbed the microphone. "Trident Base, Norfolk Control. We may lose communication. Report your status." "Second team aboard. All personnel recovered. Returning to base." Relief flooded through the room, but Rebecca knew they weren't safe yet. The helicopters still needed guidance through the storm to reach the base safely. Her failing system had to hold together for at least 10 more minutes. She pulled the final emergency measure her grandfather had taught her, directly paralleling power systems that were never designed to work together. It was dangerous, potentially catastrophic, but it might provide one last surge of power to boost the failing signal. Master Chief Rodriguez watched in amazement as Rebecca bypassed safety systems with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was risking. "Thompson," he said, "you're going to electrocute yourself." "My grandfather saved 18 sailors using circuits that should have killed him," Rebecca replied, her hands steady as she made connections that would make any safety inspector faint. Sometimes the math doesn't matter as much as the mission. The parallel power coupling engaged with a shower of sparks. Her amplifier's output surged back to full strength just as warning lights began flashing throughout her workshop. She was drawing power from the building's main electrical grid now, something that was definitely against regulations and probably illegal. "Norfolk Control, helicopter flight inbound, ETA 12 minutes. We need continuous guidance for instrument approach in zero visibility conditions." Rebecca looked at her grandfather's compass, now glowing red-hot from the electrical current running through her workbench. Thomas Thompson had risked his ship to save his crew. She was risking her career, her workshop, and possibly her life to bring 2 SEAL teams home through a hurricane. The amplifier held steady at maximum output. 12 minutes to keep impossible systems running with components that were never meant to work together. Her grandfather's compass pointed not toward magnetic north, but toward the most important destination of all, home. The parallel power coupling Rebecca had jury-rigged was pulling so much electricity that lights began dimming throughout the communications building. Somewhere in the base's electrical system, circuit breakers were probably screaming warnings that a contractor's workshop was drawing power like a small factory. "Thompson, what the hell?" Commander Hayes began, but stopped when he saw the readings on Rebecca's improvised system. Signal strength was holding at maximum despite components that should have failed 20 minutes ago. Through the speaker, helicopter pilots were calling for continuous navigation updates as they fought through hurricane-force winds. "Norfolk Control, we're in zero visibility. Need constant heading corrections." Rebecca's hands moved across her workbench like a pianist playing a concert, constantly adjusting power flows and signal routing as components failed and were replaced by even more improvised solutions. She was 3 levels deep in backup systems now, using circuits that existed only in her mind. Master Chief Rodriguez had called for base electrical engineers, who arrived to find Rebecca's workshop drawing enough power to light a small neighborhood. "Ma'am, you need to shut this down immediately. You're going to cause a base-wide power failure." "Negative," Rebecca said without looking up. "Not until those birds are on the ground." What happened next would become Norfolk legend. The base electrical engineer, a Navy veteran himself, looked at the impossible tangle of wires and components Rebecca had assembled. Instead of shutting her down, he quietly began rerouting power from non-essential base systems to support her workshop. "Building C doesn't need lights right now," he muttered, throwing switches that darkened administrative offices throughout the base. Neither does the commissary. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude as her system stabilized. The base was literally sacrificing its own electrical infrastructure to support her communication link. Hundreds of Navy personnel were sitting in darkened offices so 2 SEAL teams could find their way home. 8 minutes out, came the pilot's voice. Still need continuous guidance. That's when Rebecca's primary system finally gave up. The improvised amplifier she'd built from spare parts simply couldn't handle the load anymore. Smoke poured from the workbench as circuits that had been pushed beyond all rational limits finally succumbed to physics. But Rebecca had learned from her grandfather that when Plan A fails, you immediately go to Plan B. And when Plan B fails, you make up Plan C on the spot. She grabbed her personal radio, a high-end civilian unit she'd modified for her own use, and began connecting it to the base's external antenna array. It wasn't designed for military communications, but it might provide enough signal strength for the final approach. "What are you doing now?" Hayes asked. "Using my own equipment," Rebecca replied, her fingers flying across connections she was creating in real time. "This radio has twice the power output of anything in the building." What she didn't mention was that the radio represented 2 years of salary and countless hours of custom modifications. It was her pride and joy, a piece of technology she'd built specifically for her own emergency communications hobby. Now she was about to sacrifice it to save people she'd never met. The civilian radio came online with crystal-clear signal strength. Through the speaker, they could hear the helicopter pilot's relief. "Norfolk Control, signal strength excellent. We have visual on the base." Beginning final approach. Rebecca's personal radio, her own treasured creation, began showing the same warning signs as every other system she'd pushed beyond its limits tonight. But it only needed to last 5 more minutes. As she watched her most prized possession slowly destroying itself to save strangers, Rebecca finally understood what her grandfather had tried to teach her. Technical skill wasn't about building perfect systems. It was about sacrificing everything you had when people needed to come home. The compass pendant grew warm against her chest, as if Thomas Thompson himself was reaching across the decades to guide her hands through the final moments. "Norfolk Control, both helicopters on the ground. All personnel safe." The words echoed through Rebecca's workshop as her personal radio finally surrendered, smoke rising from circuits she'd spent years perfecting. Around her, the remains of her improvised communication system lay scattered across workbenches, a graveyard of components sacrificed for a single night's mission. Commander Hayes set down the microphone and looked at Rebecca with an expression she'd never seen from a senior officer before. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. For the first time in 3 years at Norfolk, someone was seeing her not as a contractor who fixed broken equipment, but as the person who'd just saved 14 lives using nothing but skill, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice everything that mattered to her professionally. "Thompson," he said quietly, "in 22 years of naval service, I have never seen anything like what you just accomplished." Master Chief Rodriguez was examining the burnt remains of her systems, shaking his head in amazement. "She didn't just repair equipment, Commander. She invented new technology on the fly. Half of these solutions shouldn't be possible according to standard engineering." But Rebecca barely heard their words. She was staring at her grandfather's compass pendant, now blackened from electrical current, but still hanging steadily from its chain. Thomas Thompson had used this same compass to guide him through 18 hours of impossible repairs aboard a damaged destroyer in 1969. Tonight, it had guided her through the most challenging technical crisis of her life. The workshop door opened, and several people Rebecca didn't recognize entered. Their dress uniforms and bearings suggested ranks far above Commander Hayes. The lead figure was a woman in her 50s with Admiral's stars on her shoulders. "Ms. Thompson," Admiral Sarah Mitchell said, extending her hand. "I'm the base commander. I understand we owe you a considerable debt of gratitude." Rebecca stood, suddenly aware of her smoke-stained coveralls and the electrical burns on her hands. I was just doing my job, ma'am. No, Admiral Mitchell replied firmly. Your job was to repair communications equipment. What you did tonight was save the lives of 14 Navy SEALs using technical innovations that our best engineers are going to be studying for years to come. What Rebecca didn't know was that her improvised communication system had been monitored throughout the crisis by base technical staff. Every modification, every creative solution, every impossible connection had been documented. Naval engineers were already analyzing her techniques, trying to understand how she'd achieved things that violated conventional wisdom. Ma'am, Master Chief Rodriguez interjected, Thompson's grandfather served aboard the Joseph P. Kennedy during Vietnam. She says he taught her everything about emergency communications repair. Admiral Mitchell's expression changed. Thomas Thompson? Electronics technician first class? He received the Navy Commendation Medal for saving his ship's communication capability during a combat engagement. Rebecca's eyes widened. Her grandfather had never mentioned receiving any medal. He'd only talked about doing what needed to be done when people were counting on him. Your grandfather's technical innovations were incorporated into Navy emergency procedures that are still used today, the Admiral continued. It seems exceptional skill runs in your family. Admiral Mitchell reached into her briefcase and pulled out an official document. Ms. Thompson, effective immediately, you're being offered a position as a senior technical specialist with Naval Special Operations Command. Your work tonight demonstrated capabilities we need for our most critical missions. Rebecca looked around her destroyed workshop. 3 years of carefully collected components and perfectly organized tools now reduced to blackened metal and melted plastic. Everything she'd built at Norfolk was ruined. But as she held her grandfather's compass pendant, she realized that, like him, she'd discovered her true calling, not in routine maintenance, but in the moments when impossible technical challenges stood between military personnel and home. I accept, she said quietly. To everyone who typed, respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.